Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Alison Richard, the currently Vice-Chancellor at University of Cambridge. Alison, I always start by asking people when and where they were born.
I was born in Bromley, Kent, in 1948.
March 1948.
Oh, March the 1st, 1948, yes.
Okay. What about your parents and, if you like, your grandparents? Can you tell me anything significant about them?
Well, I can't. I had only one grandfather alive when I was born, and he died when I was 2, so I remember nothing of my grandparents, in fact. A reason for that is that my father was 65 years old when I was born, and my mother was 25 years younger than he was, but even so, she was 40 when I was born. So I grew up not knowing the date of my father's birth. It was always a family secret. I now understand that it was kept from me and from my brother and sister because he was born in 1886, and I think that they thought that we would find this as children to be somehow sort of weird,
yes.
To have such an old father. Of course, I now understand as a parent that all parents are by definition weird, and they just have our weirdness in different forms. And I sort of muse on the fact that they kept my father's age from me until we were quite grown up. But he'd never married until he was 55. My father was born in Scotland, went off to South America in 1911, inspired by reading Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. This I discovered from reading his papers after he died. I never knew this. And he wanted to see the Falkland Islands. And so he sailed off. And of course the Panama Canal didn't exist. So he went round the Horn and up to Chile and spent 11 years in Chile on horseback, sending nitrate and then grain back to England, and came back in 1922. And anyway, to cut a long story short, he was working in the Royal Observer Corps in Bromley in 1941, and my mother was a volunteer cooking meals for the people working at the Royal Observer Corps. And they fell in love and got married, and it being wartime, they just put a notice in the newspapers saying, come to the church and a reception afterwards. And as my mother said, thousands turned up because they wanted to see who had finally captured this man, a 55-year-old bachelor. But the result was I grew up with a father who was a wonderful storyteller, and as I now look back on it, an old man telling the stories of his life and what he did in South America, and he was a great storyteller, and also a man of a deep happiness who had lived more than half his life, never imagining himself married, let alone with children, let alone with grandchildren. And by the time he died when he was 93 years old, he had all of that. So that's my father.
It sounds as if his interest in natural history and Darwin might have influenced you in.
Well, except that I didn't know about it until after he died. But what I do know, and you as sort of an anthropologist will appreciate this, is that when this 21-year-old in 1970 announces to her parents that she is going off to Madagascar for 18 months, and no, there is no email, and no, there are no telephones, there is no communication except possibly letters, my parents didn't blench. They supported me, and my father thought this was just grand. And I think that, what I was really benefiting from was, if you will, sort of a genetic predisposition to wandering. And that I inherited from my father.
Well, what actually did he do in South America? I mean, did he have a job, or he was just...
Oh, yes, indeed. He first worked for Balfour Williams. He first worked for the Nitrate Corporation and was sending nitrate back to the UK, and then he worked for Balfour Williams, or vice versa, and was buying grain from farmers and sending it back to the UK. But being my father's daughter, we could spend an hour and a half with me telling you tales of my father's life in Chile at the turn of the century. Suffice to say that when my elder brother was a little boy going to school, my mother got a phone call from the headmaster of his school saying, "Your son is a pathological liar because he keeps insisting that his father is a cowboy." Well, the next day Angus was sent to school with a picture of my father on horseback with his 6 shooters, wearing his Stetson, and Angus's honour and the family honour were upheld. And
That's sweet. Well, tell me something more about your mother. What sort of person was she?
well, my mother was, she died long after. My father died in 1979. My mother died in 1998 at the age of 87. She was an astonishing person and a very strong person, a very intelligent person who, in another time, would have, I suspect, would have been in our day would be a very professional, a person with a stellar career of some sort. I think that if she would hear, she would be saying to me, "I can't stand it when people say that I didn't work, because I worked all my life. I worked bringing you up, and I worked on volunteer activities, and I worked as an almoner, and I worked taking care of my mother, and I worked, with your, taking care of your father and as a wife, and this nonsense that's not work." And my mother was a feisty person, and she did go to LSE, and she did an almoning degree, and in fact loved working as what would now be called a medical social worker, I think, but was called an almoner in those days. But then her mother was ill. This was 1930 or so, and she was one daughter with 3 brothers, and so she gave up work to take care of her mother, and then and basically was, and as was the case in those days, I think, really sort of the daughter who will not marry, who will not leave home, who will stay and take care of her mother, and that's her job in life. And so she did until her mother died in 1938, and up to not married my father 3 years later.
Were either of them influential on things like your reading or your books or any of your intellectual interests at school?
She, it's interesting today. One views students whose parents didn't go to college as somehow as underprivileged, and I think very often that is true today, but it isn't axiomatically true. Neither of my parents went to university, and in fact for those of us who grew up in that generation, that was more often true than not, because so few people did go to university. But there were books everywhere in the house. There was a great love of learning. There was a great appreciation of education. There was great support for us children being educated. I was the youngest of my siblings, and I think, always viewed as the brainy one. I suspect rather sort of obnoxiously brainy, actually. But I was supported in everything I did, and I can remember still sort of saying to my mother, "Oh, you're just being nice because you're my mother. No, you're just saying that because you're my mother." But now as a mother, I think one of the sort of things one can really do for one's children is to support them and to give them the confidence to dare to do things and to dare to dream and to dare to aspire. And I certainly, particularly my mother, I mean also my father, but particularly my mother, gave me the courage to do things.
No, that's very important. Tell me about your first school. Where was that? Was that in Bromley?
That was in Bromley. A quite old school that has actually since closed. A private school for girls, day school, called Kinnaird Park. Where we, this was a school where we used to get rapped over the knuckles if we didn't get our Latin declensions right. I mean, it was...
Is this your... at what age is this? This is your...
I was 4.5. This was from the time I was 4.5 till I was 13.
Oh, I see.
And it was a very, as I look back on it, sort of Victorian upbringing. I mean, I remember the headmistress of that school walking into the classroom, standing up in front of the class and looking at me and saying, "You're a very unpleasant little girl," in front of everybody, and kind of essentially crucifying me as I now look back on it over a period of time, which I'm sure stayed with me for many years. And I'm sure she was partly right, I'm sure it was quite obnoxious, but I don't think it was a very good way of dealing with it. But it was a forceful education, that's for sure, in the 3 R's, the 3 R's plus Latin and so on. We were drilled, we were tested, we learned poetry as one did in those days. I think I could still recite the entire Piper of Hamilton if you'd want me to, or how Horatio kept the bridge, or all of the prologues to Henry V. And I haven't forgotten all of that, and when I'm in Madagascar doing field work and the animals are sound asleep and I'm really bored, I just sort of recite poetry to myself. And I think it's a great gift, and I think it's a shame that our children did not grow up being drilled into learning poetry that they then had to recite. I'm not saying there's great merit to it, but it's something that I feel I cherish.
Were there any teachers in that period between, 4.5 and 13 at that school who you remember as influencing?
Oh yes, I remember. I mean, these were all larger-than-life ladies who impressed themselves upon me positively and negatively. And in fact, one of the pleasures of coming back to the UK, having been in the United States for 30 years, is I have actually reconnected with some of the women with whom I was at that school. And every year we have lunch at the restaurant on King's Parade, actually. They come up once a year and we sit down together. And you remember why you like, across all of these years, I remember why I like these girls.
They're your contemporaries, you mean?
Yes, we were in the same form together.
Yeah. Oh, how nice.
And they were my friends at the time. Yeah.
How sweet. What about, were there any teachers whose names you remember or particularly influenced you? I'm searching for this because quite often there's a point in schooling when one person becomes, maybe later or sometimes at kindergarten, where I've had South African people like Aaron Klug and other people like this who had a teacher that really inspired them in mathematics or whatever it was.
Yes, I think, I certainly, as a general matter, have no question in my mind that I ended up doing what I did through a succession of teachers. My life path was set by not by a single teacher, though possibly when I got to Cambridge it was a single teacher or two that actually pushed me in a particular, didn't push me, but inspired me to travel in a particular direction. But at Kinnaird Park, at KP, it was the fearsome headmistress with her navy blue, tightly curled hair. I swear her hair was navy blue, and her navy blue suit, and her dark stockings, and her silver pencil that she used to bang on the table. Who, it was a 9-year trauma as I look back on it. That she taught me Latin, and she obviously inspired me. At some level. I really must have admired her or wanted to please her because she was somebody who desperately made you want to please her, because if you didn't please her, the consequences were pretty dire. Now, whether that is good teaching or pathological is another matter. Her name was Miss Forth, Miss Forth is no longer with us, but she was formidable. And it's been amusing reconnecting with these friends from that day, with us all sort of remembering what it was like to...
They all felt the same about Miss Forth.
Yeah, I think, not as much as I did though, I think, but then I was the one who was sort of singularly and uniquely unpleasant and disagreeable and bad, and morally inferior. No.
In her eyes. Where did you go on after 13?
Then when I was 13, I applied and was awarded a scholarship to go to a girls' boarding school called Queenswood, which my godmother had gone to. And so I went there to do my O-levels and A-levels. And when I went, I skipped a year, and it was very difficult because it was. I think I was a not, shall we say, a sort of fairly sort of slow developer, and there I was being put into a class with girls, already a slow developer for my age, being put into a class with girls who were a year older than me. And I can remember the horror of, wearing white ankle socks when everybody else is wearing stockings. the things that one remembers about one's schooling, but actually it was a fine school.
Where was Queen's
It's in Hatfield, Hertfordshire,
yeah.
and still going, and doing well, actually. And there I had a succession of fine teachers whose inspiration led me to continue with my Latin, and in English and in French, and to learn Russian. So it was all, I did the whole spectrum of O-levels, but then my A-levels were driven really by the resonance that I felt with the teachers that I had, and I went on and did an S-level Latin, partly because it was easy, and S-level English. But had no idea what I wanted to do.
And there was no science at that point.
There was science, yes, but I didn't do A-level science. I wasn't moved by it. Maybe I didn't think I was good at it, but I remember more thinking that I wasn't moved by it. So I did no biology I did all of the O-levels, mathematics and physics and chemistry and biology and so on, but not for A-level. It all, as I sort of talk about and remember back to these days, I am reminded of a book that you may have read by Catherine Bateson, Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson's daughter,
yes.
Called Composing a Life. And the first chapter of that, it's about six women of some fame and their lives, and it's the book is interesting. I not without problems in my view, but the first chapter of this book was just a revelation to me, because she takes up this notion of composing a life, and said that we live with what is today increasingly a fiction, particularly for women, but for men too increasingly, that lives are somehow linear affairs. And you grow up and you get a job, and then you continue in that career, and you marry a spouse, and you continue with that spouse, and life is lived in a linear way. But actually, the way that many women live their lives is more akin to the composition of a patchwork quilt. And there's a patch here and a patch there, and your task is to collect the patches and to sew them together and to make a quilt that will keep you warm at night. And it's a sort of a wonderful metaphor. And I always think that I must look like a person who has led a very linear life, sort of destined to sort of move through the academic ranks and up, and in some sort of, sort of teleological sort of move to being a Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. I don't feel that way at all about my life. It seems to be a large series of contingencies built around a fundamental interest in more or less everything. So if you have broad interest, how do you decide? Well, your teachers inspire you to do a particular thing, and thus it was. And so, when I got to Cambridge, and inspired by David Pilbeam, who was then teaching in Arkanan, decided to be a biological anthropologist, then I asked myself, of course, over and over again, why I had never done calculus, why I hadn't pursued, statistics and biology beyond O-level, because there wasn't a good match. But anyway, somehow you learn as you go along.
Well, we'll come to Cambridge in a moment. Just going back to school, did you have, apart from the formal education, were you particularly interested in anything else, like music or games or hobbies or reading or...
Well, I played the bassoon in the school orchestra because they needed a bassoon player, not because I had talent. but I played it with great. It has given me a lifelong love, actually, of the bassoon and of bassoon music. It is a vastly underestimated instrument, but once you know what a bassoon sounds like, there are many symphonic pieces that have wonderful parts for bassoons in them. So I did that, and I also sang in the school choir. Queenswood was one of the schools that Ernest Reed, who was, I don't know who Ernest Reed was, but he was a very famous man as far as Queenswood was concerned, and I think that he was somebody who nurtured choral work, choral activity in schools, is all I can think. But we used to go and sing in the Royal Albert Hall in these wonderful massed school concerts. And again, I didn't sing particularly well, but I had a very low voice, so they let me in because they didn't have many girls who could sing. I think it was fourth or some very low part. But I, as a result, sang, Benjamin Britten, the St. Matthew Passion, obviously the Messiah, all of the great choral works during my 4 years at Queenswood we sang, and once again, in a way that I didn't appreciate at the time. I enjoyed it enormously, but I didn't understand what a gift for a lifetime that experience would be. So I did that. I'm not a great athlete or sports person. I used to win quite a lot of races, but it was always the egg and spoon race, a slow bicycle race. I was very, very good on those kinds of races, but I played hockey, I think, at Queenswood, but not well at all.
Has music continued to mean a lot to you? I mean, you, having heard all this and performed in it, I mean, do you listen to a lot of music now?
Well, I mean, now as Vice Chancellor,
don't do anything.
I don't do much of anything, but my musical interest really, but the general answer is yes. When I have a life, that life involves still listening to music. But in particular, when I met the man who then became my husband in 1976, his father in particular had been very deeply involved in the development of the Michigan Opera Theatre, and opera was important in his life and by extension in my husband's life, and so my husband and I became great lovers of opera and have remained so. And I think now that when I am listening to music, it is more likely to be opera than anything else at this point.
Are there any particular composers who you like more than any others?
Well, I have very conventional tastes, and I think, and so Mozart and Verdi and Monteverdi. We just went to Glyndebourne to see El Coronazione, and it was magnificent. I thought. I mean, it got bad reviews, but I thought it was great and splendid. Now, we had very good friends. Our dearest friends, who say to us, if you want to hear good music, go to a concert. If you want to see verisimilitude, go to the cinema. And if you want sort of people in the flesh, go to the theatre. Opera combines the worst of all of those worlds. And, why would you want to do it at all? Well, I would say quite the contrary. It combines absolutely the best. And I was at the Royal Opera House a few weeks ago to see the first night of the National Ballet of China dancing Swan Lake, and it was absolutely wonderful. But I will confess to you that I kept waiting for them to start singing because there was that aspect to the performance that I sort of was expecting them to sing, and somehow disappointed when they didn't. I know that's probably a sort of terribly kind of barbaric thing to say, but it happens to be true.
Lovely. I don't know if you want to put your cup down or if you're...
I'm still drinking
my
tea.
Do you need any more? Or you're...
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Well, let's move on. There's so much more to say about one's upbringing, but let's move on to Cambridge. You came to read archaeology and anthropology, did you?
Yes.
How was it? How did you choose that?
Because I went round and round about what I should read, and it was English, maybe it was law, and then I went digging in Cornwall with a good friend of mine in the summer. We dug an Iron Age fort on some dig. I mean, how this all happened, I don't really know, but I found that really interesting, and then I read a bit about Ark and Anth, and decided that I didn't think I really wanted to be a lawyer, and I didn't sort of think that somehow English felt quite right. So I just decided in the kind of, as I look back on it, totally feckless way, well, I'll read Ark and Anth, and it sounds interesting. And so having decided to do that and applied and got in, I then applied to go to Greece, northwest Greece, with Eric Higgs, who was digging in Epirus, in a place called Yanina, and he was digging Paleolithic claves. And so I spent the summer of what we would now call a gap year, except it was 9 months then. I spent that summer in northwest Greece and decided that I would be an archaeologist, that sort of out of sort of the array of Ark and Anth, that I'd be an archaeologist. And then I got to Cambridge and actually started in the course and met David Pilbeam, who was at Cambridge then teaching physical anthropology, as it was called. And David inspired me with an absolute fascination in human evolution and the evolution of complex social system, why be social, all of those questions, and with the uncertainty and sort of dealing with the fact that we will never know for sure. You just kind of work your way to perhaps knowing a little better, and that and there was a wonderful sense of excitement and discovery. Anyway, that was what took me into physical anthropology in general. So David had a very, very important part in my life, and then the other person who did was actually two people, Robert Hind and Alison Jolly. Alison Jolly came to teach at Cambridge because Richard Jolly, her husband, was, I think, a visiting professor or visiting the economics faculty, and Alison came and taught primate social behaviour in the autumn of 1968, and I had just come back from Panama, from actually the Canal Zone as it was, from a summer studying howler monkeys, which I had decided to do because it got me out of a paper in part two, if you did a project.
Yes.
And David Chivers, still at Cambridge,
Yes.
who was a graduate student then, he said, go to BCI. And being too young and proud to admit that I had no idea what he was talking about, I said, what a good idea, thinking it was an island off the northwest coast of Scotland or something, and subsequently discovered that he was suggesting that I spend the summer in Panama, by which time it was too late to back out. So I went off to Panama and spent the summer on this island, Barrow, Colorado Island, studying these monkeys. And I loathed it. It was awful.
Really?
It was awful. It
Why?
rained all the time.
Yes.
It was muddy. I couldn't see the animals. There were poisonous snakes all over the place, and it was loathsome. And I came back all ready to write it up for Robert Hind, who was supervising the write-up. And Alison Jolly was teaching at Cambridge that autumn, and she said, what have you been doing and what are you doing? And I told her what I've just told you, and she said, oh, you should go to Madagascar because there are no poisonous snakes, and there is beautiful, dry, spiny forest, and really interesting questions about the animals. So again, I mean, and she put up these slides of the southern spiny forests of Madagascar, and that was sort of, as they say, a eureka moment. I was entranced by these improbable, beautiful forests with these amazing animals bounding through them. And this was sort of really before, Zoo Quest to Madagascar, David Attenborough's Zoo Quest to Madagascar, that was new at the time, but nobody was familiar with this strange other world that had evolved in Madagascar for 80 million years, independently of the mainland. So.
Just returning to one or two of the people, Robert Hind, who I've interviewed, was a formidable figure. I mean, he's very gentle in his interview, but he admitted he'd made Jane Goodall burst into tears with his supervision and things. What was he like?
Oh, terrifying!
Just
absolutely,
pop it on
thank
the
you. Absolutely terrifying. I was really. I remember vividly the first time I met him. He asked me sort of to tell him what I knew about territoriality and birds. Well, I didn't know very much, but I thought the man, was keen to sort of to know. So I told him what I knew, and he said, "Oh, as I thought, you don't know very much at all." Well, it was kind of clunk. Anyway, when I was named as Vice Chancellor. When that was announced, I got a letter from Robert Hind,
Yes.
and I was thrilled, because I've seen him occasionally over the years, and he said, I remember you vividly as a student, and my heart beat faster. And he said, for two reasons, his letter went on. The first is that you are the only person I know who went on an owner-driver maintenance course with Land Rover in Solihull. And the second is that you're the only student that I know who left for Madagascar to do field work with a down-to-the-ground black fur coat as part of her field attire. Well, I was crushed. I mean, I thought this man had remembered me somehow for my mind, but no, it was for my skill sets and my clothes. Anyway, I teased him about this since. And it's wonderful to see him still going strong. Yeah. But I obviously didn't leave much of an academic impression on him. But never mind. But again, when I think back to these teachers, whether it's Robert Hind who terrified me, though he didn't mean to be in the way that Miss Forth at my first school did, but in very different ways and with different styles of doing it, these are people for good reasons and ill perhaps, who make you want to be really, they somehow take up your ambition level. That would be an observation of mine. I think there is no harm in that. The paper that I wrote and subsequently published on my work on Barrow, Colorado Island, the work that I put into it was because I wanted it to be really good, and I wanted it to be really good so that he would think it was really good too. Now, again, analysts and psychiatrists might have their own view of what all of that is about. But I experienced it as something where you were striving for something worthwhile and of value. So,
well, physical anthropology's gain was social anthropology's loss. I just wondered whether, the people who were lecturing you in social anthropology, presumably only in the first year, must have been people like Maya Fortes or Jack Goody or Edmund Leach.
Edmund Leach was he was either on leave or not lecturing to undergraduates. Maya Fortes taught me. Jack Goody didn't teach me that year. It was Maya Fortes and
Tambaya? S.J. Tambaya, Stanley Tambaya?
Yes. And yes, and so you say, well, so, but they were lecturing. I don't remember. You see, I don't remember the supervisions that I had in social anthropology, and that somehow tells you something. I mean, they just didn't stay with me.
Yes.
Whereas
David Pilbeam did.
The David Pilbeam supervisions I remember vividly still.
So let's, I always slip in at some point a question about religion, because often it's late, just around the time one comes to university that one begins to question one's religion if one had some upbringing in a religious framework. So can I ask you about your religious background, beliefs? Were your parents practicing any kind of religion? Or?
My parents, I think my mother probably, I suspect I know she grew up in the Church of England, but we always went to the Presbyterian Church, now the Reformed Church or something, but anyway, it's the Presbyterian Church, the Scots Church in Bromley, every Sunday. It was what you did on a Sunday morning. You walked to church and then you sat through rather interminable lessons and so forth, and then you went off to Sunday school, and that was church. And then at Queenswood, that was a Methodist school, and there was chapel every morning and chapel twice a day on Sunday, a fairly brief chapel. I can't say it meant a lot to me, and once I'd left school, I didn't go to church, and we kind of, that whole piece of my life dropped out. But when our son died, when he was a baby, it's a cot death, as it's called.
Your first child?
Mm?
This was your first child?
Yes. No, it was our third child.
Mm.
It was to the minister of the church in our village that he comforted us in ways, and the service of Gavin's funeral service was conducted by him. And his faith, the flickering of his faith in the midst of that darkness, was important in helping me to survive that. And so, and I think, at the time I thought that whether I believed or not, there was comfort from that at the darkest moment in my life. And that my willingness, when somebody said, would you like us to call the minister, that my reaction was yes, because it was familiar. It was a familiar relationship with a church. And after that, we started taking our children. Our daughters were then, when Gavin died, our older daughter was 7, and our younger daughter was 5. And my husband and I, at that point, made a decision to take them to church every Sunday, really, and it's sort of explicitly, because if anything so awful were ever to happen to them in their lives, we wanted to give them the possibility that what had made a difference to me would also, should it befall them, make a difference for them. And maybe it would, and maybe it wouldn't, who can tell. But, so we went to church for many years. I go to Great St Mary's now on occasion, not that often, as in my role as Vice Chancellor. But there is another, the other aspect of this, of course, is the role of religious studies, but also engaged scholarship and outreach in the life of a university. And there is an argument that in a post-Enlightenment world, there was no room in a university for engaged, in a rationalist world, engaged scholarship, the scholarship of and by believers. But I don't actually accept that for a moment. I don't think a university is by any stretch of the imagination entirely based on sort of rational, empirical endeavours. We know that's not true. And if universities don't engage in a really serious way with matters of faith and spirituality, one will leave it to the crystal gazers and the zealots. And so at Yale, the divinity school there and the Department of Religious Studies were an important part of the landscape with which, as provost, I worked to renew and support. And coming to Cambridge, it was an absolute delight, because at Yale I was told that the Department of Religious Studies, which studied about religions, had to be a mile away from the divinity school, where people engaged in scholarship from inside a sort of their beliefs. But that you have to keep those two a mile apart, literally a mile apart, for them to coexist happily. And I got to Cambridge and found that in the divinity faculty here, there is a mix of, if you will, secular and engaged scholars, believing and maybe unbelieving, but less believing, people who approach their scholarship from a different point of view. And they all seem to get on and so I'm told. I'm sure everybody has their argument, but there wasn't. It's very interesting that there isn't this sort of very clear schism that has developed in the United States. There was a newsletter that has gone out of print in the United States, but was very interesting for a while. And I remember the headline on one of their issues was called "Taking God Out of Religion," and it was all about the breaking up of religious studies departments, the breaking apart of religious studies as a tradition in US academia from professional schools training ordained ministers and so forth. And at Cambridge in the UK it's configured very differently, and the boundaries are not drawn in that way.
That's very interesting indeed. I mean, this is rather brutal, but if you had to classify yourself as a believer, as an agnostic, as an atheist, and there might be other choices, where would you classify yourself?
Oh, I would classify myself as an agnostic. I mean, I don't think... in my view, you cannot know enough to know that there is nothing that you don't understand, and I think it is hubris to assert that there is nothing that is within our comprehension. But to sign up to a fully elaborated religious system of beliefs is something that I can't reach.
I mean, at the moment everyone is, or a lot of people are were watching Dawkins on Darwin, and it's quite a good litmus test to ask whether you feel that Richard Dawkins, who you must know, view that science and religion are not compatible and that science has disproved religion. What's your views on that assertion?
I think that there are there are a multitude of very distinguished believing scientists, and it is empirically simply not sustainable as an argument, in my view. But I'm sure that Richard Dawkins could out-argue me on this subject any day of the week, but I just remain deeply sceptical that he's right. In fact, I think there is every evidence that he isn't. And I also have to say that I don't find it terribly interesting as a line of argument, so I'd sort of rather sort of leave it at...
Yes. Well, that's the general consensus. Okay, well, let's go on to, at the end of your time at Cambridge, unless there's anything, I mean, as an undergraduate at Newnham, is there anything you want to say about Newnham as a college when you were here?
Well, I just a few weeks ago did an interview with some graduate students at Newnham who are making a series. They're trying to record Newnham alumni from as far back as the oldest they can find, coming up through time, sort of talking about what Newnham meant to them and what their experiences were, and how Newnham equipped them. And I didn't have a lot to say to them about Newnham per se, but it's curious looking back on it, because when I was at Cambridge as an undergraduate, there was one girl for every 7 or 8 boys here. But I didn't experience it that way, because I lived in an all-women's college, so I had plenty of women friends, and it's sort of actually very interesting. It allowed, I suspect, that we led more normal lives than the men did, if you will, because there were plenty of men for us to be friends with, which was not true for them in the other direction. It's certainly within the university setting. But we also had this sort of this rich array of wonderful and remarkable women living in Newnham, and so it was both as a sort of a maturational experience personally, and in terms of sort of providing the basis for friendships of a lifetime. It did those things for me, and I did forge the friendships of a lifetime at Newnham.
Are there any friends who you'd like to particularly
No, I'm not.
There's so many.
No, there aren't so many, but there are some. And at each of, I told you about my first school and those reunions, and my second school, Queenswood, and reunions is too strong a word, just a coming together of people. I mean, there are women now who I met and came to know at each of those three stages in my educational experience, who with whom I have common threads still in my life, and remember when I see them why I like them, and that we still do. It's quite interesting. It's quite interesting.
Well, let's then move on, because did you think you might stay here to do a PhD? Because you went to London, didn't you?
Yes, no, I wasn't going to stay here and do a PhD. I'm not sure why, but the students that I have taught and trained, I think that they have been given a far more sort of rational and systematic framework for thinking about what they do. Career counselling, sort of advising students about how they imagine their trajectories, I think is a relatively recent thing. Or maybe I just was kind of sort of dense or whatever, because I keep, again, it was another of those sort of transitional points in my life. Why did I decide? I know that I thought that maybe based on what Alice and Charlie told me about Madagascar that would be very interesting. But then I somehow got it into my head that what I wanted to do is functional morphology. And John Napier was one of my heroes. I didn't know him, I hadn't met him, but I'd read his work. So I decided that I wanted to study with John Napier for my PhD. But how I really imagined that, with no training in anatomy to speak of, I mean, it just sort of looks to me completely ludicrous. Anyway, I went off and met John Napier in London, and he said he'd take me on as a student. And I gave him a proposal to study the comparative functional morphology of the jaw mechanics of leaf-eating lemurs in Madagascar. And I applied for money from the Royal Society and the Explorers Club of America and one or two other, got a NATO scholarship, and went off to Madagascar and changed my mind on the plane about what I was going to study. It's just completely horrified looking back on it. And what I ended up doing in Madagascar was a compare, and I'm very glad I changed what I was doing, because I was utterly unqualified to study the jaw mechanics, the chewing mechanics of injury. And I ended up doing this comparative study of this one species, Propithecus feroxi, which is the big white lemur in Madagascar, living in these wonderful, amazing spiny forests of southern Madagascar that Alison and Charlie had inspired me with the love of, and in a much wetter, greener forest in the northwest of the country. And the question was, if environment determines social behaviour, how do these two very different environments differently shape the behaviour of a single species living across different environments? And that was the subject matter of my PhD.
And it was fun and interesting and...
Well, it was very interesting, but it's problematic because, of course, you find differences between the animals in these two forests, and then you make up a story as to why they're different. What you've actually proved is another matter, and in fact that whole line of research has moved a very long way since then, not least because of the work of Tim Clough-Brock, who is of course now a Royal Society professor here at Cambridge, and was a year ahead of me when I was an undergraduate. Yes, we used to write to each other when he was studying red colobus in Tanzania, and I was doing my Propithecus research in Madagascar. I've still kept the correspondence, these very serious, intense letters about sort of the ranging behaviour of our animals. Well, Tim went on much more than I to really articulate a serious and intelligent way of thinking about these kinds of issues.
But it was successful. You got your PhD, and
yes.
John Napier continued as your supervisor, even though you changed.
Yes,
subject.
yes. And he, when I went for my PhD defence, he said, well, I'll let John Crook ask the questions, dear, and I'll pour the sherry. So
Those were the unreformed days when your supervisor was one of the examiners, is it?
yes.
Still, I suffered.
There
benefited.
were 3 examiners,
Ah.
and I can't remember who the third is, but John was one, John Crook from Bristol was the other, and I'm not sure who the third was. But I've not forgotten the comment.
Very nice. What did you do when you finished that?
So then, what I was going to do was go off to Alaska and study the behaviour of muskoxen with a man by the name of Paul Wilkinson, who had been a graduate student of Eric Higgs and who I had met when I went digging in northwest Greece before I came up as an undergraduate, and we'd stayed friends. And he was undertaking a very interesting project with, I think, the support of the Kellogg Foundation. He was an archaeologist, is still an archaeologist, and has an interest in the domestication of wild animals, of wildlife, and was working on a project to domesticate muskoxen and to harvest their wool, not by shearing them, but by pulling it out of them. And the idea was that this wool is of extremely high quality and that it could be done in a kind of artisanal cottage industry way by Eskimos living up in the Alaskan, above the snow line in Alaska, as an alternative to working for oil companies, sort of to provide some sort of high return, sort of socio-economic, socio-culturally appropriate alternative sort of not subsistence, but alternative activity to oil. And they were interested in having somebody have more understanding of the social dynamics of these animals. So I was actually quite interested in doing that. I thought it sounded different and also of value in doing something good for people, as well as of interest from the research point of view, because I was really interested in muskoxen behaviour. They're very interesting animals. They're still interesting. But in the middle of all of that sort of starting to happen, I got a phone call from David Pilbeam out of the blue, who by now had moved from Cambridge to Yale, where he was professor of anthropology. And he phoned up and said, you must be finishing your PhD and we have an opening for an assistant professor in physical anthropology, and would you be interested in applying? And I was completely flummoxed and said, where's Yale? I didn't know. And I flew over and gave a job talk in the spring of 1972 and got offered the job. And again, without sort of thinking about this in any serious way, said, oh, great. So off I went to the United States, to Connecticut, in the autumn of 1972, never imagining that it was going to be the next 30 years of my life. What did I imagine? I don't think I imagined anything very much, which is probably just as well, because I think there's a lot in my life I wouldn't have done if I'd thought about it very much. And since I haven't regretted what I've done with my life, I think sort of a lack of imagination may be quite a good thing.
Reminds me, at some point you obviously got married, and is Richard your married name or your maiden name?
My husband's name is Dewar.
That's right.
It was the side of the Dewar family that didn't fight on the side of the Campbells, and as a consequence got thrown off the Highlands. The piece of the Dewar clan that fought with the Campbells is now Dewar's Scotch.
Yes.
My husband's family, unfortunately, sort of fought with the Loyalists, the Scottish Loyalists, as it were, and ended up being kicked off the Highlands and going off to Canada, and then drifted down into northern Michigan. And my husband grew up in Michigan and was a graduate student at Yale in archaeology. And in fact, his supervisor, Chung Hong Chi, was the chairman of the department at the time I was recruited, and he always took credit for us being married, because he had recruited me to be married to his graduate student. So it wasn't quite as simple as that, because Bob was married at the time. But he went off to Taiwan and did his PhD work, and he and his wife, they decided to go. They then went their separate ways at that point, and Bob came back single. And I had remembered thinking that I rather fancied this man if he hadn't been married. Well, miraculously now he wasn't. So that was 1974.
Oh, well, my question was actually just at the right moment then.
Yes, yes.
By chance. And he's remained an academic, or Bob?
Well, yes, I mean, he was doing his PhD. I was at Yale, then he went on to the job market, and it was before the job market in the States had closed down, so he was offered jobs at UC Santa Barbara, the University of Hawaii, and then most closest to Yale, SUNY Potsdam. Well, that's on the St. Lawrence floodplain, and it's kind of a post-nuclear Holocaust landscape, and we were convincing each other that commuting across the Adirondacks to see each other would be just fine, a 6 or 7 hour drive. And then at the 11th hour, miraculously, he got a job at the University of Connecticut, which is, and so we then got married, bought a house, and at the midpoint of the shortest route between Yale and the University of Connecticut. So we each commuted 40 minutes in different directions, and probably, I mean, the chances of being gainfully employed anthropologists living within 40 minutes of home is, and married, is absolutely amazing. But he's an archaeologist and a human ecologist, and did his PhD work on the origins of agriculture in Taiwan. But as it turns out, the conditions for preservation of organic remains in Taiwan are not good, and so he found a lot of pottery, but he didn't find the kind of the grains and the organic remains he would have wished for. So he was actually thinking of going for after he finished, and he couldn't work in what we then called mainland China at that time. That was completely off limits. So he was going to work in Indonesia, perhaps. But I kept saying to him, Madagascar is really interesting because the megafauna all went extinct, and people arrived late. They colonized the island in the last 2,000 years, and what on earth were they doing that drove an entire megafauna to extinction within the 500 years of arriving there? So around 1975, Bob started working in Madagascar, and still has major research projects going there, as well as in, he's not working in New England now, but he has been working in New England and on various more theoretical issues. So he is here at Cambridge, a fellow at the MacDonald Institute of Archaeology.
Yeah, yes, I was wondering.
When he's not being consort to the Vice-Chancellor, which is another piece of his duties.
Tell me a little more, well, there's so much to say about Yale, obviously. That isn't where you met a mutual friend, Keith Hart, is it? At Yale?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Because he was there for a while. Tell me about Keith, just to get it off our shoulders, so to speak. He's remained a friend, hasn't he?
Keith arrived, Keith was an enormously important intellectual influence on me and on Bob. Because he had a deep belief in the intellectual coherence of anthropology, which of course is rare in these days. And he came to Yale driving an agenda of intellectual engagement among the subfields of anthropology. And he would come up to our house 40 minutes outside New Haven. And I have a feeling that being 40 minutes away from this kind of, this vortex of Keith's intellectual activity was part of why our friendship has always remained good. And he would come up to Leverhulme, and we would, argue late into the night, and Keith would be running flags up poles, and many of the flags, you'd say, oh no, that's really, come on Keith, and the flag would be hauled down again, and then up would go another flag. And there was brilliance amidst this sort of cascade of ideas. we've remained good friends, and though we don't see him that often, but we don't see any of our friends very often. But in terms of giving me still a sense that anthropology does have as much sense as a discipline as many do, the epistemological, sort of methodological fault lines notwithstanding, Keith drove that into my brain more than anybody else had done in a really, really uncompromising and I think, unforgettable and very cogent way.
If I could ask you a little more about going from Cambridge to Yale. American universities must have struck you as very different in their ethos and institutional structures. Can you remember what it felt like going to a university in America?
Yes, because I remember I went to Yale from Cambridge by way of Madagascar and London.
Yes,
so
yeah,
there was
right.
that sort of interlude of not feeling very much a part of any institution, if truth be told. And then I arrive at Yale, and the most striking and dramatic and traumatic aspect of that is, of course, that I was expected to stand up in front of a class of 60 or 70 students and lecture to them twice a week for 13 weeks. And I had not only never done anything like that, I had never experienced anything like that as a student. And I made the enormous mistake in my first class on my first day of standing up and saying to these students in all honesty, well, I don't really know what I'm doing, but let us learn together. And I thought this was a fine thing to say, but you could hear the knives coming out of their scabbards and the sort of sharpening of knives. And it was absolutely and utterly traumatic and appalling because there was this enormous leap between what I had ever experienced or learned up to that point and then what I was expected to do. So yes, there was a huge cultural shift right there. And then also, this is the United States of America. I'm an ocean away from my friends, my family, everything that I had been used to. But one is 24 years old, and the world, life is an adventure. And I quite quickly settled in and felt very grown up. I remember that because I had a salary, and I'd never had a salary before. And my salary starting at Yale in 1972 was $10,000 a year. And I lived like a graduate student, so I saved almost all of my salary and had savings, and that is a quite sort of magical moment in life. I think it does sort of define some sense of autonomy because you are really finally doing it completely sort of on your own and so on. So partly I think because I've never been very reflective. I've never imagined what things might be like, let us put it that way. And I'm rather glad that I haven't, because I think that if I had imagined what things might be like, I might never have done them. And that I would have regretted in due course. But it was a big leap. It was a big leap, but it was, they were extraordinarily wonderful and interesting and rich and productive years of my life, and of course we have the friendships of a lifetime now there as well.
Who were you talk of the friendships of a lifetime. I think it was David Pilbeam who got you over there. Were there other people who became your colleagues and influenced your work in America, who you'd like to mention?
Well, in fact, all of the colleagues where does one begin? Harold Scheffler, who is retiring this next week. There's a retirement party for him at Yale to which I've been invited. We talked together on the application of Darwinian theory to human social systems. That was intellectually important to me. Joe Errington and I taught a course on language and symbols in human and non-human primates together. There was wonderful seminar co-teaching. Huang Chi Chung and Emily Ahern and I taught a seminar my first year at Yale, which was called the Food Seminar, which looked at food from an anthropological perspective. All of these people, Keith Hart, who you all know from here, was enormously influential for me. John Marks, my colleague in biological anthropology. The list is a very long list. So the answer is yes, I was much influenced intellectually by my colleagues in anthropology.
Did you find, you mentioned seminars and you've mentioned your lectures, the distinctive feature of your undergraduate time anyway in Cambridge, one of the distinctive features is this personal one-to-one, one-to-two supervision. Was that also present in Yale at that time?
Yes, indeed. So what were called reading courses. And I would do, particularly for third and fourth year students and all the students who were doing their senior projects, would have one-on-one, essentially what we would call supervisions. And of course with my graduate students, much of the work done with graduate students was done one-on-one. So that is indeed an element. But that, of course, the reason I haven't mentioned it is that's the element with which I was completely familiar and comfortable. It was the performance element of lectures and the systematic way in which one was expected to decide what constituted the knowledge that these students should acquire, which is itself a heavy responsibility, and then how do you convey that, which is the second heavy responsibility. And the answer, I would say, as a self-report, is in my own case was deeply inadequately for many years, as I sort of learnt on the job how to do this. And even now, if I were to return to teaching, because I haven't taught now for some years, I believe that my experience as a provost and a vice-chancellor would itself actually further influence the way in which I would approach teaching, because one learns about teaching and communication even doing a job like this, or so I believe.
One of the strange things about lecturing when I came to Cambridge was that I think we had one tiny induction half hour where we were told something like, make your lectures interesting in a rather boring way. And that was it. You were expected to just be able to do it. And I've benefited from the fact that my wife did drama, and so she used to come to my lectures and tell me what I was doing wrong. And I used to film some of them and watch the films, but most of my colleagues would be horrified at either of those. I mean, it's always struck me as rather odd that lecturing is thought of as so important, and yet it may have changed, but on the whole very little instruction is given about how to lecture, just to take away some of the bad things anyway. Was there more instruction in America?
Not when I arrived at Yale. There was nothing. You were just supposed somehow to know how to do it. But over the years, yes indeed, exactly sort of, you could invite people to come in and video you when you lectured. Graduate students were given training in how to teach. And indeed at Cambridge, as I'm sure you know, there is now a capacity to help students and staff to work on becoming better supervisors and teachers. Now, not everybody avails themselves of that opportunity, but I think it's right and good that those opportunities should be present. Heaven knows, education and teaching is absolutely a central purpose, and it's quite strange that we provide no training. Now, if my husband were here, he would be saying that no training in this kind of formal sense in the world could come close to what he learned from sitting in the back of Sidney Mintz's lectures as a teaching assistant. And a part of the way that graduate students learn about teaching in the US is indeed the experience of being teaching assistants and watching their seniors, their academic staff, deliver lectures. Now, depending on how well they deliver those lectures, that may or may not be helpful. But of course, Sidney Mintz was one of the great teachers of his generation, you know, and so Bob felt that he did learn an enormous amount from Sid about how to do it.
Well, Sidney is one of the people on my interview series, so very interesting, nice to hear about him. Did you know him at all?
Sid Mintz? Oh, indeed, absolutely. In fact, he was back in Cambridge. I saw him and he came and we had tea in the garden with him and Jackie. Maybe you saw, this was a couple of years ago, 3 years ago.
He was interviewed in the States for me.
He left Yale a couple of years after I got there and went off to found the anthropology department at Johns Hopkins.
Yes, that's right.
But he was a warm and welcoming senior member of the faculty when I arrived in 1972, and Bob was quite close to him as a graduate student and teaching assistant for him, so we became in some sense friends and colleagues.
I mean, you've gone on later to do a lot of important administrative jobs. Was this an early interest? I mean, from the beginning, did you find yourself on committees and chairing things and so on, or was it accidental that you gradually moved towards administration?
I would say that I didn't seek it out, and it was more accidental than intentional. And in fact, as I look back on the early years, I can't really remember committees of importance at the university level that I had anything to do with at Yale. My first administrative task, if you can call it that, was to be Director of Graduate Studies for the department. And in many ways, I still look back on that as being the hardest thing I ever did, because it wasn't really about administration at all. It was being there, in some measure it was, but what it was really about was being there for graduate students. And graduate students have many needs, and in fact will have sort of an infinite level of need for support, engagement, advice, and so forth, or so it seemed to me. And where one draws a line and says, enough, I too have a life, was very hard for me to say, and it was my first task of that sort. And I nearly drowned doing that because I cared about the students. I've remained friends with some of the students that were sort of under my care during those years. And I look back on it and think that I went far beyond what was probably sort of appropriate, even in terms of trying to mentor these students. But that was the first thing I did, and from that then it became sort of an obvious step to become chair of the Department of Anthropology. And then one's colleagues would phone one at night to sort of complain and about this and that. But the kind of the raw emotional neediness was missing. It was much more sort of the politics of a community of adults with some shared sense of purpose, but a lot of politics sort of muddling that, and particularly, of course, in an anthropology department that was a 4-subfield department where you are crossing epistemological divides, and certainly in the 80s that was very much the case. I think that things have now sort of knitted back together more clearly, but in the kind of postmodernist world of the early mid-80s at Yale, holding sociocultural anthropology together with physical anthropology was less about sort of intellectual convergence than it was about simply trying to keep everybody civil and respectful of each other's enterprise. But it was an interesting time, but it was less arduous than being Director of Graduate Studies.
How long were you chair of the department?
Well, I must have, from 86 to 91, I think. I was chair of the department until I became director of the Peabody Museum.
One of the difficulties of being chair of a department here, which I've done a number of times, is that it sort of answers to the well-known description of responsibility without power, because in Cambridge the head of department, most of your colleagues have tenure, they have college positions, they're roughly the same age, and they don't want to leave Cambridge, so you can't write bad references for them or good references. There's nothing you can do. I mean, basically it's like as I explained to my students, it's like a band of hunter-gatherers. There's no chief. You are just the person who might be more persuasive, or people will decide to follow you or not as they desire. So a huge amount has to be done through basically charisma, through showing that you're doing more than anyone else, and through charm, and through cajoling and beseeching. I've always imagined America as more centralized, and therefore some accounts I've had of universities suggest that basically the chairman has some power as well as responsibility. Is that true?
On the margins, yes, it may be more possible for a chairman to make people deliver on the expectations of the institution, which exist here as well. But in all matters of any consequence, should there be a language requirement for the graduate program in anthropology at Yale, these are not matters that a chairman has any standing on. You chair a room full of people who will argue about these issues, and I don't look back on the chairmanship as being a position. I think there are I'd go so far as to say there are no positions of real authority at the university. Any position that may look as if it is a position of authority, it is simply because one is effective in somehow managing to extract from the debate a direction of travel that that is acceptable. But it isn't that one has led it in some sense or directed it oneself. Or very often not. Now, others would disagree, and there certainly are models, I think, and perhaps more often in the sciences, of strong department leaders. Maybe. I don't think that the difference between the states, between Yale and here, is as strong as some might imagine it would be. There is a difference. It is easier to lead there, but I'm not sure that there is more power or authority. It's just easier to lead because people are more willing to be led, which is a very different thing from talking about real power.
I think it's partly based by a recent story I heard of someone who went to Princeton and proceeded to sack almost all the people in the institute he'd gone to, younger staff anyway, who didn't have tenure, and then brought in a whole lot of new people, and I was astonished because you couldn't do that in Cambridge.
I mean, the tenure system means that junior colleagues come up for review and for then promotion or departure. It's up or out. But some of the greatest and deepest and most problematic schisms in anthropology over the years occurred when there were disagreements about whether people should be promoted or not. That is the single, it is the currency of the realm, as it were. Who do you want to keep? That is, at Yale, the chair of the department had no authority to make those decisions. In fact, to the contrary, you were simply trying to manage the arguments amongst your colleagues and to bring it to a conclusion that doesn't leave too many wounds and too much healing to be done when you get to the other side of the decision. Now, it's easy if everybody is agreed that it's up, and it's easy if everybody agrees that this person has no chance, but it's that middle ground where people have deeply different views for a variety of reasons.
Well, I'm not sure it's possible to articulate this, but you've already explained how your approach in chairing committees to a certain extent, which is to find the middle ground, to find the way people are prepared to be led, rather like a hunter-gatherer elder who can't force them, but they can say, well, that looks a good direction. You mostly seem to want to go in that way. Are there any, it's trivial to call it tips, but things you've learnt, wisdom or ideas you've learnt about how to get consensus or to manage committees, which would be helpful for other people to...
I must have learnt, well, I would hope I must have learnt something, but I couldn't articulate that for you. I don't know. I don't know. And what I was actually reflecting on when I was listening to your question was, if one is always looking to find the middle ground, does that mean that one misses the opportunities for radical step changes? Yeah. And what does that say about that style of leadership and about how I personally have led insofar as I have led? And I guess that I think that there are radical step changes at universities. We know there are. You and I both can see that, but they actually play out over a somewhat longer period of time than one normally associates with a radical step change. You don't go into a room with one kind of system and walk out of it with another kind of system. But if you take the question up to, say, a decade, then one can see radical change occurring. And I would submit that a very good example of that at Cambridge is the changes in the demography of our undergraduate population, which I still think it is just extraordinary that an institution that had been dedicated to the education of men by men for almost all of its history, in the space of 10 years, would take a residual tolerated presence of women and transform it into a 50-50 undergraduate population. That was radical change. But it took a decade or a bit more to actually sort of implement, and one could argue that there were 50-60 years of precedent leading up to it. So Cambridge is capable, like other universities, is capable of deeply radical change. It takes longer, and so then the question becomes, is it taking too long, and are there some radical changes that one should expect to happen and happen faster? It's not evident to me that is the case. I don't look around and sort of say, oh, we should have done X or Y by now, because I think that these institutions are actually sort of, if you will, using sort of, they're optimizing for much longer periods of time than a year or even 5 years.
Well, this could lead in a couple of directions. I mean, coming back to how one operates in committees and elsewhere, I mean, I found as chairman of our faculty that I could get through the business very fast if I thought about what I thought was the best possible solution and proposed it to a group of people who trusted me and as colleagues. And I remember getting through whole agendas with no discussion at all. I would outline the arguments for and against something and then say, would it be sensible to do this? And people would keep quiet, which was how you then moved on. And I had another colleague who did the same thing, and you could get through meetings very quickly like that. But I'd already worked out in my mind what was probably the best answer to the question. But it sounds more as if you go into a meeting half with the idea of what would be a good solution, but very open to...
See, I think that's very interesting. Yes, you're right. I mean, I go into meetings well briefed and with some sense of what I would hope the direction of travel would be, and often with some knowledge of what is at the table. And I dare say that we could get through the business of these committees faster if I did what you pursued the model that you're describing. But I, perhaps to a fault, have a sense of the Vice-Chancellor's authority being still at Cambridge a highly sort of questioned and challenged issue. And maybe that's because occasionally I bump up against the limits of what it is that I may or may not say or do in ways that constantly surprise me, and I'm constantly aware of the fact that I don't fully understand how Cambridge thinks about what a Vice-Chancellor is and does. I believe that that is changing and evolving, and I am cautious about asserting a leadership role that, as provost at Yale, I didn't, think twice about being, saying, well, this is what I think. But here, I'm much more cautious, and I say maybe arguably too cautious, in that it wastes a great deal of people's time to sort of sit and thrash around to reach a decision that actually was reasonably obvious at the outset. But that, I'd be interested whether people who have sat at the tables that I chair would agree with my assessment of my own performance, because maybe I am seen, if I can put it this way, as bossier than I feel myself to be. I don't know.
Well, it's very, very interesting, because for many years, we had an extremely good chair of our faculty board, Kate Pretty, and my only reservation about Kate was that the meetings went on for a very long time, when it was quite clear to me, having been chair before her, that this would be the outcome. Instead of summing it up and in a few moments and letting us get on and having the meeting lasting half an hour, it would often go on for 2 hours, because she would sit there and say, has anyone got any comments? I had the feeling that she felt that since the faculty was important and we've come there, the more people who contributed and the more it was an open discussion and the longer it went on, some ways the better, for cohesion's sake and other reasons, even though in the end we always ended up.
But there is, yes indeed, and there is some middle ground in this, because of course the risk of going in and telling people, sort of essentially laying out the arguments and saying this is the best argument and nobody responds, is that people leave the room and say, well, we were steamrolled, we didn't get a chance to speak.
Yeah.
And Cambridge being sort of the feisty and kind of independent-minded place that it is, there is a risk of that. And I'm sure that we all make somewhat different judgments about how far you can, as it were, push your luck in sort of asserting an outcome and assuming that if people really don't like what you're saying, they will actually say so in the room, as opposed to leaving the room and then saying so. And I've encountered some of the latter, from time to time, as you must have done too.
The last point, I'd just come back to the other theme, which was women in Cambridge. I was astonished to read, the usual folklore that I picked up was that women were not formally admitted into Cambridge properly until about 1948. But in fact, there was a long period in the 30s. I was reading an account of Cambridge in the 30s for the British Association, and it said that women went to all the lectures, they did the ordinary courses, they took the ordinary examinations, they were registered as having taken those exams, so they would have a BA from Cambridge and so on. And yet they weren't in statu pupillari in the usual sense. In other words, it was very ambiguous. They had almost everything except formal recognition. De facto, they were the same as everyone else. De jure, there was a difference. It seems a very sort of strange muddle for quite a long period,
a strange model, and also a scandalous model that was demeaning to those women.
Yes.
Because the first Wrangler was there was a woman who was the first Wrangler in the 20s, 30s, I've forgotten who she was, but it was before, maybe earlier, it was way before de jure, women were recognised. I think it is one of the sort of great blots on Cambridge's history in the 20th century that it took until 1948 for these women who were, as you say, so much a part of the Cambridge community to be given formal recognition. It was just I don't know how that can have not happened. I haven't studied it. I don't understand it, but it's regrettable.
Well, it was, as you know, came to a vote very early. I mean, about 1906 or something like that. And,
yes.
was thrown out. I was reading Virginia Woolf's an extract from Virginia Woolf's *A Room of My Own*, and she describes this memorable day when she came to have dinner or lunch in King's, and then she went to the university library and was going to have a look at something, and they stopped her and said, "You can't come in if you're not accompanied by a man." She said as she walked down the steps, "I'm never coming back to this library again," more or less. You know, it's demeaning.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
Virginia Woolf. I mean, this is.
I mean, it's just extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your time as in the department at Yale, but you were then appointed at some point to be head of the Peabody Museum. How did that come about, and what were the high and low points of that experience?
I think I told you this, that I started out being asked by the president of the university if I would consider being director of the Peabody Museum, and I said no because our children were young at the time.
Yeah.
And so he said, well, would I serve on the search committee? And so I spent 2 years describing to various candidates why this was the most wonderful job, and completely internalised my own rhetoric. And so then in 2 years' time, having failed to persuade anybody to take this position, the president said to me, in one of the few humorous things he said, well, your children must have grown up by now, so you can take the job. And of course, by that stage, I was hoisted by my own petard and took it, and indeed loved it. I think that a natural history museum at this juncture in history, if you can say that the 19th century and to some degree the 18th century, but particularly the 19th century was the age of collection, then the 20th century was the age of wringing your hands about what you do with all this stuff in these enormous museums, and provosts sort of look jaundiced because they take up enormous amounts of space, and just the fact of trying to understand what you have was an insuperably large task, I believe. And there was a real loss of steam over the course of the 20th century, not amongst those who were the aficionados, but in the sort of broader academic and intellectual community. But of course the new technologies allow one to capture information and then to be able to share it. So it has given the idea of access and sort of the way in which these quite remarkable records of the history of life on Earth that are contained in natural history museums can be made accessible, sort of organised. It's been transformational, and that occurred in the space of the last decade or so of the 20th century. And I was at the Peabody Museum at that moment when the collections manager was saying to me, impossible, you cannot possibly capture in an electronic digital form the sort of the nuance and the detail that more or less with their quill pens they were writing into these great big ledgers. There is no format, no template that would allow us to do this. And within the space of a year, they had undergone a complete transformation. We had 18 million accessioned objects in the Peabody Museum at Yale, and it was supposed to take decades to get all of this into an electronic catalogue. By the time I left after 3.5 years, because they were completely fired up to do this, it was happening at the speed of light. And of course that makes the collections of the Peabody accessible around the world. With what is going on environmentally in the world today, to have a historical record of going back 150, 200 years of various parts of the world, carefully kept and stored away, gives you a real sort of new read on environmental change from a different perspective. So all of that is interesting, and it's not like, a book can be read many times and new meanings can be derived from one's reading, but one fundamentally reads it in the same way with the use of one's eyes. But of course these objects in a natural history museum can be read in profoundly different ways as technologies evolve. So it's, being able to extract DNA from subfossil material and from fossilized material even, for example, gives you a whole new, completely and profoundly different way of understanding the meaning and the messages that are in these objects. So it's a very exciting time where the oldest and sort of most traditional of traditions, dating back to the Cabinet of Curiosities and prior to that, and then through the great tradition of collecting, intersects with the technology of the here and now in ways that were just incredibly exciting intellectually. But then, on top of that, of course, university museums are portals to the larger public and have this an exhibition function to my way of thinking, as a deep responsibility in terms of their mission, because they are a way in which people can find their way into the intellectual life of the university, quite literally, by coming in and by being captivated by wonderful exhibitions. Well, how does one wonderfully exhibit things? Well, how much writing do you put up on the wall? And of course, since the Natural History Museum at Yale included human material culture, there are then, as you will know far better than I, incredibly interesting debates and discussion to be had about the display of human material culture. Who is displaying it on behalf of whom and to whom, and how do you situate it? So all of that made it for me a really, really rich experience. It was a wonderful 3.5 years, and in fact, when the president then went on to ask, and we did all kinds of things, the president asked me to serve as provost for the university. I really didn't want to do it, because I was not done in any sense with what I wanted to accomplish in the museum. We were building new storage facilities that would ensure the good stewardship of these extraordinary objects, and we were reconfiguring the exhibit spaces of the museum. It was great. It was just wonderful with this very, very diverse staff and curators who worked with me. So there is a big piece of my heart that is still actually in the Peabody Museum, and it was just great fun, whichever day of the week it was, when at the end of the day I went and spent an hour with Nick Thomas in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology here, and all my juices were flowing again. I would have happily sort of taken up residence there, I think.
I mean, it must be rather nice being in a university such as this, which has a number of very interesting museums all congregated quite close together. And but one thing it's not directly relevant, but I was talking to a Japanese visitor yesterday and telling her about the history and culture of Cambridge, and she said, does Cambridge have a visitor centre like Oxford where you can learn everything you're telling me? I mean, people take guided tours round. Is there a place where you can go, where you can see the old maps and where you can watch films of famous people and all these sorts of things? And I said, well, there was a plan many years ago. The mathematician Edwards thought of taking the old Addenbrooks over for a museum of that kind, a science museum, a great science museum, but it never came to anything. But that I've always thought it's a terrible, wasted, lost opportunity. We get millions of visitors coming through. If we could give them a portal to enter, not just see the surface of Cambridge, but go inside it a bit, which you can't do in a busy working place by letting them into departments, or then we would educate them and interest them and do something worthwhile. And having the Vice Chancellor here to mention this too, has this ever been discussed, or?
Well, it was certainly something that was under discussion when I arrived here. Not as you have presented it, in my view, but there was a sort of a plan on the table that would have put a visitor centre into King's Parade, a very modern sort of visitor centre. I'm very sympathetic to the idea of a visitor centre, but I think you have to think very hard about, would it be for all these tourists who come, or would it be for prospective students, or is it how museum-like? I mean, you're suggesting something that is more, maybe not museum-like, but it's something that doesn't correspond to what I think of as a visitor centre, which is a place with pamphlets and not much depth to it.
No.
But I think that Cambridge is very hard to visit in any kind of serious way. You see that. You see that. But you see the tourists walking along King's Parade, taking photographs, and then there's of what? And I mean, of iconic buildings about which there is no explanation except what their tour guide is telling them. I think it's a very unresolved issue for Cambridge as to how tourism works here and how we would wish it to work here. There are too many tourists, I think, who are coming in charabancs and spending very little time here, and if one could do it, it would be preferable to have maybe somewhat fewer tourists spending more time here and somehow being able to penetrate the meanings and the richness of Cambridge, which the blue badge guides do brilliantly. But as you say, you can't invite tourists into departments and or even into colleges in large measure. It's too disruptive.
Thinking of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, which is hopefully going to have a new entrance and and a new downstairs and temporary exhibition. I mean, something there, which was the Museum of Cambridge University and City, which encouraged people to come in and to listen to lectures by famous Cambridge figures and to have...
You put it in the Corn Exchange?
Yeah, that would be ideal, absolutely a perfect place. Somewhere like that. I think it could have a wonderful effect and also answer the people who say, well, what is the university doing?
I completely agree with you. I have to say that my scepticism with the vision as it was presented when I arrived here was also coupled with a sense that there are so many needs here, and this would not go to the top of the list. I mean, adding another museum, unless you found a donor who was interested in doing only that, it would be hard to justify diverting the resources to that when all of our museums have so little dedicated funding for them. And I worry because we're entering into times when I can only believe that things are going to get tougher, not easier, and they exist on very little as it is. So there's all of that plays into it. But of the fundamental proposition, I think Cambridge is an inimicable place to be.
No one knows
visitor.
who was here. I mean, even to my friends and colleagues, I tell them about the roll call of great poets and great philosophers and great writers and painters, artists, as well as scientists who've been here. And I point, this is where the translator of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam lived on the other side of King's Parade there, and Nabokov had a room there, and that's where Hardy discovered this, and that's where... And they're amazed. I mean, I do what these tour guides do, basically, but if this was institutionalized, so you didn't have to take your chance with a tour guide, and you were taken round Cambridge, and then you could say, well, I'd like to know more about molecular biology, and now, for the first time, you could do this. So you couldn't do this 10 years ago, but with modern technology...
You could do it. And then you could, having taken the virtual tour, you could then go out and sort of see the things that were being explained to you.
Exactly. So it would be a double tour. You first... It's like in some of the big American museums, you have an orientation film before you go around the museum. as you know, in the Museum of American Life. And it would be something like that. Spend your first hour or 2 hours learning about Cambridge's history and the people who've been here and so on, and then look round and you will see the gargoyles which you didn't know were there. You know, it'd be so much richer and more interesting, and people would come back and do it again.
And Hobson's Conduit, which
Exactly.
gives rise to Hobson's Choice.
Yes.
It's, there's lots in the city as well as the
Exactly.
university.
Anyway.
Its time will come. Its time will come.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, let's go on. You did succumb to the persuasion to move on from the Peabody to become Provost of Yale. Tell me something about that experience of being now head of a very big university.
Well, it was a very hard job. The division of labour at Yale, the president has primary responsibility for setting the sort of, if you will, the general, articulating the general strategic directions, and for the externalities, the alumni, national government, state government, international relationships. And the provost's task is the day-to-day oversight and running of the academic and administrative activities of the university, building the operating budget, building the capital budget. Now that presents it as too stark a division of labour, because actually we talked every day and lived inside each other's heads, and so I never would have done anything major without consulting with him, A, because he is very wise and astute, and B, because he is the president, and it's not for the provost to be sort of setting off on new tangents without having the support of the president. It was said at Yale that the task of the president was to walk through rooms with people making requests, with the president saying yes, and the provost would follow behind saying, I'll study it. But I was never put in that position by our president. He never sort of put me out, never exposed me to be sort of, so there was never daylight between us. We worked really as a team. And of course I thought I had the more interesting job, and he thought he had the more interesting job, I think. But I loved being a provost. It was, now one looks from this side of the Atlantic, at least until the last few months, and you look at the enormous accumulation of wealth at Yale and wonder how it could have been a tough job to be provost. But when I became provost in 1994, we were running a $20 million deficit, and it was projected to grow to $150 million, and my first task was to sit down and figure out where we would save a lot of money to bring the budget back into balance. So there's a sort of certain sense of being there, done that.
And you succeeded?
But it was overseeing all of...
And you succeeded in doing that?
Yes, but we succeeded in no small measure, because the Yale endowment grew so rapidly that we kind of grew out of the problem rather than the revenues grew, rather than having to save a lot. But you never feel any richer, because academics, I believe, if they are any good, and Yale academics are very good, Cambridge academics will imagine creative and wonderful ways of spending money before it's actually even quite materialised. It's always because the aspirations and ambitions of the institution will and should always outstrip the available means. So whatever there was at Yale was always committed well in advance of the money showing up across the transom, so to speak. So there's always attention, but to be working in a very sort of, you know, on the ground, roll up one's sleeves way with senior academics thinking about working on very interesting problems having to do with the academic programs and institutional policies of Yale, and that was what I did for 8.5 years, and had practice at thinking about an 800th anniversary, because of course we went through Yale's 300th anniversary in 2001, so it was a rehearsal for our 800th year. But they were very interesting years, and it does not surprise me that in these difficult times that are kind of breaking over the US universities at the moment, I mean, our turn will come, but as their endowments have plunged, I think that there is general agreement that the letter that Rick Levin, the president of Yale, just sent out to alumni last week is the most thoughtful and well considered of these letters that US university presidents have been sending out in some numbers. It's a letter of reassurance and seriousness for the Yale community. I know just how hard he worked on that letter because I've seen him do it before and done it with him, and it's good. It's good, but that doesn't make it easy times. They've got a big hole in the budget as a result of this autumn's activities and events.
Well, one could have a whole interview further on Yale, but I'd like sort of to draw it into the last phase of your coming to Cambridge. Did you have difficulties in deciding when you were approached, presumably, to become an effective Vice-Chancellor, the first woman to be an effective, not just a ceremonial Vice-Chancellor at Cambridge? Did you?
Well, I would say I had no difficulty when I was first approached in saying that I had no interest in the position. I was very clear in my mind, so I had no difficulty. And when I was offered the job, I had no difficulty accepting it instantly. So,
what happened between?
So what happened in between is the interesting question. And the short answer to that question is after refusing to have anything to do with it over a period of several months, I was then persuaded by my husband and daughters, and somewhat too, it should be said, by the indomitable Tony Badger, who was chairing the search committee, that I should go over for one day, that I owed it to Cambridge, I owed it to myself. So I came over for one day and was far from persuaded. I remember being far from persuaded. But then I came back and forth over the course of an autumn and met members of the search committee and people outside the search committee as well. So I was being sort of looked at, as it were, but I was doing my own due diligence, except that the due diligence sort of took the form of kind of falling in love with Cambridge all over again, so that by the time I was offered the position, I was absolutely clear that this was a completely irresistible combination of a great university with its flags flying, its ambitions set high, and all kinds of challenges. And so you put those two things together, and I hoped that my experience from the 8.5 years at Yale could be helpful to Cambridge, not to bring, to sort of plop things down here in any simple-minded way, but simply there were things that I'd learned and thought about that seemed to me might be helpful here. And so I felt I had something to contribute, or hoped that I did. I saw this wonderful combination of excellence and challenge, and third, and not least, I met people who impressed me deeply by their wisdom and thoughtfulness and their ambition for there to be change at Cambridge. And it was not just a few people, it was enough people who because I don't think that you can accomplish anything by yourself in a university, and that it's all done by working with people. And if you're going to work with people, you better be sure that there are enough people who are like-minded with whom to work. And I satisfied myself that was indeed the case. So then it became then it wasn't difficult at all to say, oh, absolutely, how could I possibly not? So that was my frame of mind in December 2002, when I was unveiled, if I can use that term.
Can you, I mean, is it appropriate to mention any of the people with whom you've worked and who, from perhaps early on, were the sort of people who were helping you to affect changes and work in Cambridge? Are there people here who...
Well, I mean, I think it's invidious to single out names. I mean, obviously there are senior members of the, or maybe not obviously, but senior members of the administrative staff of the university, but not just senior, and then the academic leaders of the university, the chairs of schools, heads of departments. But it isn't only that, of course, because that's not actually the way universities always work, or perhaps even often work. And there have been and still are wonderful activities here of importance where I find myself working with people who are just sort of great, effective, passionate leaders without holding these more formal offices of the university. And if it's something that everybody is behind, as it were, and sort of enthusiastic about, then I put my shoulder to the wheel, you know, as it's appropriate and helpful for me to do so. So there's some of that too, and it's I learn enormously and enjoy it because there's a great sense of you know, shared enterprise when you're trying to accomplish something through frustrations and thick and thin. I mean, nothing is necessarily very easy, which is not, in this instance, a reflection on sort of the processes of Cambridge somehow being difficult. Or the processes of Cambridge take time, but I think if your cases were argued, they're not that difficult actually. But it's more sort of securing gifts and getting structures set up and thinking things through in an intelligent way. I think Cambridge is right to take more time so that what we do, whether it's the development of a new policy or the installation of a new piece of the institution's academic landscape, those processes tend to be slow because I think they then become, they're slow because people want to consider them, and they often undergo, in my experience, modification along the way for the better. It isn't that they're chipped away at and you end up with a poor compromise. My experience is that actually Cambridge is very good at coming to an outcome where there is a change from what was originally proposed, but the quality of the outcome is actually better than what was originally proposed. And because people have all had a go at it, it is then embedded in a way and becomes part of the fabric of the place. And you know, it's not that it, you know, there are frustrations to be sure in that, but I have come to feel that the way that we do things is far more defensible than I think I probably felt the first year or so that I was here, where maybe I've just got worn down. But I don't think so. I think you come to understand things in different ways.
I mean, not today, as you know, Cambridge has been placed, not absolutely universally, but almost universally as the top of in the recent research assessment exercise as a research university in the United Kingdom, and it's generally up in the top few in the world in all the Jiaotong and other indexes. It's a very difficult question as we end of a long week, but why do you think it is such a successful place, not merely in research, but also in teaching, and teaching in the widest sense of helping young people to become adults? I mean, what is it about Cambridge?
I just have to go back to the beginning of your question and say that the headlines that are proclaiming Cambridge, of course it is pleasing, and I would be less than honest if I did not say that I'm delighted that Cambridge should be being recognised as a university of great and broad strengths, paramount in this country, and a global player, as they say. But the idea that it's a simple affair of ranking, if you look at the data that is underlying this, I mean, in some broad sense, we can say, with reason, I think, that in general, our peers have looked at what we are all doing as a sort of collective community of scholars and think that it's pretty fine. But it's not all fine, and there's lots that's extremely fine at other institutions, and in fact, there are lots that at other institutions that is finer than what we are doing. So sort of a triumphalist notion of what this all means is not one that I would that I have in my mind. But I'm pleased because yes, there is great strength here, and I think we all knew that. But it's good to have that affirmed. It's also, I think, good to have it pointed out to us where we might have thought that we had extraordinary quality, and perhaps it's not as good as we thought. So there is some complexity in this. To what does one owe all of this?
Because I'm
this
thinking
quality?
that as a historian looking back over the last 400 or 500 years, and there's no university on this planet that has contributed as much in a broad way, in not just in academic subjects but in poetry and many other things, as far as I know. And many visitors, great visitors to England, said this, and there is something about this, as you've often said yourself, this damp, remote fen town that seems to generate a lot of creativity and expertise.
Well, you have to take out most of the 18th century, I would argue, from that statement. Really, one of the things that's very interesting about Cambridge's history is, yes, indeed, Cambridge has transformed the way the world works, transformed the way the world thinks, contributed sort of created wealth to this world to a degree that is staggering. But it hasn't been all through its history. There have been some bad patches. One of the things that interests me is how it is that Cambridge has emerged from those bad patches to become truly great all over again. And I don't know enough about, when I'm no longer Vice-Chancellor and have the time, I'm actually very interested to understand how this institution pulled itself or was pulled out of periods of doldrums to once more sort of flower with whatever it is that enables it more often than not to flower. Now, one has to, there were far few universities for much of our history, so there wasn't as much competition. I believe that the relative autonomy of universities in this country for much of their history has been enormously important, and I think today that people confuse autonomy with the receipt of public funding. They are not one and the same thing. It is possible to receive public funding and to have a high level of autonomy. Possible not to receive public funding, and perhaps to not have as high a level of autonomy as one would wish. I do think that those go separately. I do think that as we become more and more relevant to society, and I think we are being perceived as being more and more consequence, more and more relevant to society, the temptation for society to try to get its hands into this activity, which is increasingly it recognises is of importance to it, that temptation is going to grow. I have not encountered anywhere a will to undo the autonomy of universities. I don't think this is ideologically driven. The will to engage, and I take government in this instance to be, as it were, a proxy for society at large. But because I think that the power of that autonomy is recognised. But so I think autonomy is one piece of it. I think being beautiful is a piece of it. It's a beautiful place to be. The colleges provide a scale that is
referring to Marilyn Strathern, or at least she
it's
talks
the
about.
genius of scale.
Yes.
That wonderful phrase that I heard her give, which I believe that she hadn't ever said it before, but as soon as I heard her say it, I knew that in a single phrase she had captured exactly what needed to be captured about this brilliant ability to be big and small at the same time. And Cambridge, that has been part of Cambridge's sort of configuration from, obviously sort of from the earliest days. So you've got all of that, and then you've got to ensure that somehow or other you manage to attract extraordinary people into this free, nurturing environment, extraordinary minds. Now, how that happened, I don't think Cambridge went out and recruited people in the way that we now go out and very systematically try and identify who the brilliant minds of our day are. I don't know through those centuries how that process worked, and I have the sense that it was a much more self-selected.
It's a Darwinian process, random variation, selective retention, exactly as Darwin describes it, because you get, Aaron Klug or Sidney Brenner or something arriving randomly, but they're kept, they're selectively retained, because there's a recognition of, or Fred Sanger or something, a recognition of ability, and they stick with the place. They like it, and the place likes them.
But as important for Cambridge, or perhaps even more important, as important, are not only those whom Cambridge attracts or retains, but it's those we send forth. And of course, Charles Darwin is the example. And if you had to weigh whether it is Cambridge academics' ideas and innovations and discoveries that have had the more transformational effect on the world, or the students that Cambridge has educated and sent forth into the world, that would be a difficult, and who then through their own work, creativity, leadership have contributed to the world. I don't know how the scales would come down. Doesn't matter. Both are important, I would submit.
But certainly, for instance, in something like drama and the media and films and so on, what is done in Cambridge is nothing compared to what is done by people who were trained in Cambridge and went up through the system and then went off.
Yes, exactly. It's a very, very good case in point. And it's done in Cambridge in this extraordinary way that is not driven by the university, not even really supported by the university. It's the spontaneity of the creation of institutions about which people care passionately and work very hard at. It's amazing, absolutely amazing.
And it's obviously related to the fact that it's a total environment, as anthropologists call it. In other words, it's not a 9-to-5 office environment. When you come for the short and intense terms, your whole life is taken over by it. So it's a moral sphere, a mental sphere, a ritual sphere, as well as an educational, intellectual sphere. And so you expand in all these ways, or you should do as a student coming here. And so even those who most deny that it ever had any effect on them directly usually have a footnote saying, well, actually it changed my life. Nabokov is an example. He said, he couldn't see any direct effect of Cambridge, but actually he knows it suffused all his writing thereafter, and there are many people who are the same. Coleridge or whatever. Anyway, I shouldn't be telling you these things. I should be.
If I just to one last reflection, because I have been asked this question, what is the secret of Cambridge's success? It does give, it is hard not to keep sort of I don't stop kind of fussing about that, and trying to understand how a single when most institutions don't survive, and it is said that there are only 85 institutions in the world that have been around at least since 1520, And of those 85, 70 are universities. Well, and of course we do a good bit better than 50 and 20. But when you pause and think about that, if it is even remotely accurate, it's an extraordinary statement about universities as very, very different kinds of organisations from most organisations. And mere survival would be remarkable, but the fact that we have not only survived, but here we are on the dawn of the 21st century, truly with our flags flying. It's a splendid university. This needs explanation, and I sort of offer you sort of inchoate thoughts about this, but I don't think it has been adequately explained. I've not seen or read a good insight into this.
Just to end, bring it back to yourself. You mentioned that when you cease being Vice Chancellor, you'll look into the history of it more. How long is your term? When?
My term ends on September the 30th, 2010.
And what are your plans then?
I have no plans. I plan to get my life back. I plan to do a lot of things that I haven't done for 15 years.
Including visits to Madagascar?
Oh, yeah, but yes, I mean, I have obviously, as you know, been going to Madagascar during all of these years, but for just sort of painfully short periods of time. And there's all of this data that I've been collecting all of these years with my colleagues, and there is sort of, maybe there is a book, not a book about my own research. The data that I've been collecting there, and now being the primary investigator for that research is one of my actually two of my former graduate students. So I'm, if you will, a junior author or an aging author with respect to that work. But we have been collecting data about the people, the demography, prices of rice, and infant mortality, and also sort of the passage of birds and butterflies and all of the wildlife, threats to the forest, and what's been going on there. So it's a 25-year history of a community of people and their environment. And I don't know whether there is something serious and worthwhile to be extracted from the data and to be turned into something that would be anthropological in a broad sense. I would be reluctant to write something that was just sort of half-baked. That's my fear, that it's not serious enough. But I'm greatly attracted to doing that, if truth be told, because it has been this big, long thread in my life, and I haven't brought it all together in any way. So maybe that's one thing I will do, but if I do that, I'm not going to do it full time. I don't want to do one thing full time. I want to be able to smell the roses and inquire into other matters, like this sort of episodic sort of undoing this idea that Cambridge has been consistently great for 800 years. I'll just like to go back and read as much as I could and try and sort of solve, probably just for my own satisfaction, sort of come to try and understand a bit more about what I think about all of this, because I haven't had time to think in a serious way about this institution's history, or I've chosen not to make the time. I've spent my time living in the present and trying to help ensure that the future remains bright.
You mentioned smelling the roses. Does that suggest you're a gardener, or?
Oh, I'm a gardener, yes, except I haven't been a gardener now, because the Vice-Chancellor has no time for it and gardeners to do the gardening. And I have actually come to understand that just smelling the roses is not altogether bad. It's lovely to walk around with one's beautiful garden, to which one has done absolutely nothing oneself, and really enjoy it, and there is a role for that. But I really enjoy to be with my sleeves rolled up and a trowel in my hand, on my, on my hands and knees out in the garden digging something up or weeding or planting or whatever. So I'm really looking forward to being a gardener again. I love to cook, and we love to cook for friends, and we cook for friends one night of the year, basically, Thanksgiving. And that's it, and I miss that. I mean, there are just parts of life that don't have to do with high-minded things, but have to do with things that I enjoy, and enjoy doing with my husband. I mean, that's this is a consuming task, and I have always enjoyed my life with my husband, and there is not enough of that life to enjoy with him. So there's a rebalancing in our lives that I'm really looking forward to, actually.
That sounds a rather nice, gentle note on which to end, unless there's some large or small topic which you would have liked me to ask you about and say anything about.
No. I mean, I think with respect to the future, the safest thing to say is that I've never known what I was going to be when I grew up, and I still don't, and I have no idea. I mean, I don't intend to disappear and sort of potter the rest of my life. That's not what I have in mind, but I haven't decided, and I don't want to think about it now. I'm painfully focused on Cambridge and the interest and excitement and rightness of this great 800th anniversary celebration at a time of such tumult and disarray in the world. I mean, I'm increasingly, I worried about our 800th anniversary celebrations because they can be such a dreadful, self-congratulatory wallow. And I never thought that Cambridge would do that, because self-congratulatory wallows is not something Cambridge is very good at, would be my observation. But then you sort of wonder, well, what's the point? And something, what are we doing this for, and who's it for? But I actually believe that it will be a very sort of seriously affirmative activity over the course of this coming year, when there is so much it seems to be sort of in motion, and so much is uncertain in the world around us, and yet, you know, Cambridge persists. So, you know, I'm seriously excited at this point about that, and that's got all of my attention, and managing our way through whatever storms will come our way, and there surely will be. I mean, Cambridge is not immune to what's going on in the world, and all of our revenue streams are being, or will be, I anticipate, hit one way or the other. So it's going to be tough as well, but we'll survive.
We'll survive.
Something like that.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Alison. That was lovely.
Well, it's a long. As I said to. I'm sure I said it to you, but I've said it to my husband and our daughters, because they have heard something of these long conversations, that I have now fulfilled all of my responsibilities to communicate about this. And I don't, writing a memoir is not something that I have any interest in doing, but this is wonderful.
Thank you.
Posterity can make of it what they will. I will go and worry about my letter to my successor and advise that person to look at Alan Macfarlane's archives if he or she wants to know what was going on at Cambridge. That would be good.
That would be good. It'll be a time capsule. Lovely. We talked about many things in your life, but I know that one of the most important parts of your lives, and something which you might want to say more about, and why you didn't say more about it before, are your two daughters. As a biological anthropologist, it's rather strange in a way that knowing how important family relationships and blood and so on are, that you didn't say more about this in the previous interviews, but I expect there was a reason for it.
Well, when I read the summary, written summary that you sent me of previous interviews, I had a series of reactions. But one of them was that there was something absent, something missing in all of this, and it took me a little while to understand that what was missing was mention of our daughters. I mentioned our son Gavin, who died, but not our wonderful daughters who have flourished and grown up, and that any kind of it was in the first instance completely incomprehensible to me that I would not have been talking about them. And in fact, I came back to you and saying, well, you have left our daughters out of your written account about whom I spoke. And you wrote back and said, no, you didn't speak about them. And I couldn't imagine how that could have been, because they have permeated my husband's life and my own life together and independently at points over the years when we've each been off doing fieldwork and been home alone with the girls. And so I was deeply puzzled about the oversight. And I thought and thought about this, and actually came to understand that now that our daughters are adults, 26 and 28 years old, there was actually...
Their names are...
Bessie and Charlotte.
Oh, yes, I think
Elizabeth.
Yeah.
But Elizabeth has been known as... We decided we'd give her the choice of not always calling herself Bessie, but she's actually, so we called her Elizabeth, but she has continued to call herself Bessie. I realised that at some only partly conscious level, but it was actually partly conscious, I was censoring talking about the girls out of respect for them, because I didn't want to appropriate their lives, their adult lives now, in an account of my own life, and I felt that they were entitled to privacy, if you will, and not their parents, their mothers telling. But it's kind of, that's, I mean, and I think that's right, but I also think it's absurd not to mention the fact that that more, they mean more to us than anything else in our lives, and have been a source of greater joy to us than anything else in our lives. So I felt that sort of, in some sense of completeness, that simply to register that would be a good thing to register. So I would add that.
Thank you very much indeed.